My parents looked me in the eye and told me I'd get nothing from my grandfather's $34 million will. Nothing. At his funeral, they sat in the front row, grinning like they'd already won, whispering about which mansion they'd move into, which cars they'd buy. And me, I sat there swallowing every word, every laugh, feeling like I'd been erased from my own family. Then the lawyer opened the will. He read one single sentence. And in that silence, I smiled. I'm Riker, and this is my story. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love seeing how far my story can reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if my story touches you, please consider subscribing. Every time you do, it reminds me that my voice matters, that someone out there cares enough to listen. That small act helps me keep sharing, and it means more than you know. The heat that morning in Houston felt heavier than usual, pressing through the thin walls of my ground-floor apartment near I-45. The ceiling fan rattled overhead, struggling against the thick air, while outside, the hum of trucks on the freeway bled into the constant drone of the city. I lay half under the hood of my '67 Mustang, hands black with oil, when the cup of coffee I had balanced too close to the edge slipped and shattered across the concrete floor. The dark liquid spread in uneven lines, pooling beneath the jack stand, as if foreshadowing a mess I didn't yet know I was about to step into. Mrs. Ramirez, my elderly neighbor, shouted from across the lot about her sprinkler system. She knew I'd always come by with a wrench, even when I didn't have time. That was my rhythm here in North Houston, fixing what broke, living paycheck to paycheck, keeping the Mustang alive because it was the one thing that made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. Then my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made me freeze, Marcus Langford. His voice was low, deliberate, as if he had rehearsed the words. He told me my grandfather, Elias Hawthorne, had passed away 3 days earlier. The funeral would be held at First Light Chapel, and afterward, the will would be read at his office downtown. I remember wiping the grease off my palms with a rag already stained beyond repair. The man who had taught me patience with engines, who once said family mattered more than oil money, was gone. I barely had time to absorb the blow before another call came through. This time, it was my parents. Preston's voice carried the smug sharpness I'd grown used to, with Vivian's smooth disdain echoing in the background. "You're not getting anything," he said flatly. "Don't embarrass yourself at the funeral. This isn't your world." Their laughter trailed off before the line went dead, as if they were already celebrating their inheritance. I stood in the garage, surrounded by motor oil and the smell of gasoline, caught between grief and the familiar sting of their rejection. As I moved to tidy the tools, my hand brushed the inside of the Mustang's glove box. Wedged behind an old manual was a cream-colored envelope, my name written across it in Elias's steady hand. 3 words beneath it, "Open after the funeral." My chest tightened. Why hide this here of all places? I slid it into my back pocket without breaking the seal. I knew then that no matter how loudly my parents mocked me, I would go to the chapel. Elias had taught me to finish what you start, even when the world tries to push you out. The afternoon sun slanted through the dusty garage, catching the hood of the Mustang in a golden glow. For a moment, it felt like he was still there, reminding me that the truth has a way of shining through, even in the dirtiest of places. When I think of Elias, I don't just remember the old man in a work shirt teaching me to crank an engine. I remember the stories he told late at night, his voice carrying me back to Houston in 1987. He said it started with rain hammering the tin roof of a TMX cantina called Lone Star. The smell of grilled carne asada filled the air, country music twanged from a jukebox in the corner, and that's where he first saw her, Leora Chen. She was young, fierce, a consultant with a mind sharp enough to slice through any boardroom. That night, she was locked in a heated argument with the manager about why women weren't trusted to run the night shift. Elias said he couldn't take his eyes off her, especially the flash of a red coat draped over her shoulders. When she dropped her business card onto the bar, he picked it up, called the number, and within 6 months, under the glow of the same neon lights, he proposed. Their wedding was modest, but their dreams weren't. Together, they built Hawthorne Energy Solutions, starting in a cramped East Houston house, where Elias fixed pipes between shifts at the refinery, while Leora drafted business plans at the kitchen table. Slowly, their hustle pulled them toward River Oaks, where mansions and manicured lawns whispered that they had arrived. But comfort bred tension. Elias wanted to raise their son, Preston, with grease on his hands and mud on his shoes, teach him to fish, to fix things that mattered. Leora wanted him fluent in numbers, computers, and the language of ambition. When Preston was a boy, Elias built a solid oak dining table, etched with pencil marks from his homework. Years later, that table was hauled to the curb, replaced by glossy walnut beneath a chandelier. Elias told me it felt like the past had been wiped clean, like the boyhood of his own son no longer had a place in their house. I was 14 when I stumbled into Elias's study and noticed a frame propped awkwardly against the wall. Inside was the company's first invoice, and across the top, in neat type, it read, Founder, Leora Chen. I froze. The whole family narrative had always cast Elias as the visionary, the builder. Yet, here was proof that the first spark, the origin of everything, belonged to her. I never told anyone what I saw. I tucked it away in memory like a secret key, knowing it might unlock something bigger later. At dinners, Preston carried a sleek Mont Blanc pen his mother had gifted him, flaunting it as though he'd already inherited the empire. In the corner closet, Leora's red coat hung in a glass case, preserved but forgotten, a relic of a fire that once burned bright. Even then, the cracks in the family story were visible if you looked closely enough. And as I sat in my apartment, decades later, holding Elias's sealed envelope, I wondered if he had finally decided to tell the truth the world refused to hear. I grew up surrounded by the polished streets and towering oaks of River Oaks. But my heart was never in those houses with manicured lawns and chandeliers. While my classmates were being driven to private schools in black SUVs, I would spend weekends in East Houston with Elias in his garage, a place that smelled of gasoline and dust, where tools clanged and motors groaned like they were alive. That was where I felt like myself, not in the echoing dining rooms of River Oaks, where silence was only broken by the sound of silverware on porcelain. My parents had other plans for me. Preston insisted I take business courses, hammering into me that numbers were the only language that mattered. Vivian curated my schedule as if I were a brand being launched, surrounding me with tutors and networking dinners. When I told them I wanted to work with engines, to understand the hum of machines instead of the language of stock reports, their disappointment was loud and sharp. They began calling me the weak link, the one who would never live up to the family name. At 16, Preston slid a thick envelope across the counter one night, $3,000 in cash. Stop wasting time in greasy garages, he said. Get yourself a suit. Learn how to stand in the right rooms. I stared at the envelope, then pushed it back to him without opening it. His face tightened, as though I had spat on the legacy he imagined for me. He muttered something about failures breeding failures, and that was the first time I realized my choice to walk a different path would forever brand me as an outsider in my own family. At 21, Vivian dressed me in a crisp shirt and dragged me to a charity gala, smiling for cameras as she pressed me into shaking hands with donors and executives. The night was carefully staged, lights and speeches rehearsed. But when I saw boxes of supplies being carried in only for a photo opportunity, I couldn't stomach it. I slipped out, loosened my tie, and found myself in the back alley with workers struggling to fix a faulty generator. I spent the rest of the evening elbow-deep in wires, making sure the shelter's lights stayed on. When Vivian discovered I had disappeared from the ballroom, she was furious. "You embarrassed us," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. But for the first time, I felt proud of what I had done. Elias saw all of this. Late one night in his garage, while the Mustang's hood was propped open and oil dripped steadily into a pan, he looked at me with tired eyes and asked a question that has never left me: if you had to choose between money and doing what's right, which would you choose? I didn't hesitate. I'd choose the direction, not the number. He said nothing, only nodded. But the weight of that silence was heavier than any lecture. What I didn't know then was that silence carried decisions that would change everything. As I sat in my apartment years later, with Elias gone and his envelope hidden in my Mustang, I thought back to those words. Each moment when I refused to bend had set me further apart from Preston and Vivian, but closer to Elias. I wondered if he had seen enough in me to entrust me with something I wasn't ready to carry. The thought of the will made my stomach tighten. Had he written me out like they said, or had he left behind something none of them expected? I closed my eyes, hearing the low hum of the Mustang and seeing the dust swirling in golden sunlight through the garage window, just as it had the last time Elias spoke of regret. There was something in that dust, something waiting to be uncovered. And soon, at his funeral, I would find out. The morning of the funeral, Houston's sun bore down like it wanted to melt the city into the pavement. I drove the Mustang across town, its engine loud and raw against the silence of luxury cars gliding past me on the freeway. When I turned into the parking lot of First Light Chapel, gleaming Teslas and polished Cadillacs lined the roads. Heads turned as my car growled to a stop, eyes flicking with that same mixture of judgment and amusement I'd grown used to. Some smiled, as if I were a trespasser in a place I didn't belong. Inside, the chapel was dressed in grandeur. Gothic arches stretched toward stained glass windows, where sunlight fractured into reds and blues across polished wood. Orchids stood tall in vases, their petals trembling in the air conditioning, and the organ's notes echoed solemnly across the marble floor. My parents stood near the altar, greeting guests with broad smiles that seemed more fitting for a corporate gala than a funeral. Vivian's pearls gleamed under the lights, and Preston clasped hands with oil executives, like the service was another networking event. I found a seat near the back, tugging at the sleeve of my worn shirt. The fabric felt wrong against the sea of tailored suits and silk dresses. Whispers rolled through the pews like waves. That's their son, the one who works at the refinery. Some shook their heads. A few old acquaintances of Elias nodded politely, though pity clouded their eyes. When the service began, Preston took his chance to make me smaller. Standing tall before the gathered crowd, he said, "My son won't be receiving anything from my father's estate. He chose to walk away from the family's path. He's just a refinery technician." Laughter rippled quietly in the corners. Vivian added, her voice light but cutting, "At least he could have dressed properly. This is a funeral." Their words weren't whispers, they were daggers meant for everyone to hear. I sat still, fists pressed against my knees, the heat rising in my chest. I expected to feel humiliated, but instead, there was only a dull ache, the kind I had carried all my life. Then, from the other end of the pew, a man leaned toward me, gray-haired, his face weathered by years in the oil fields. He whispered, "Elias used to say you reminded him of himself more than anyone else." His words landed heavier than the ridicule. In that moment, the noise of the crowd dimmed, and I could see Elias's smile in my memory, hear his voice telling me not to let time's dust blind me to the truth. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass, scattering dust motes in the air, and for an instant, it was as though he was speaking again. I lifted my eyes and caught Marcus Langford at the back of the chapel. He gave me a subtle nod, a look that told me something was waiting beyond this ceremony, something that would shake the certainty painted on my parents' faces. As the organ swelled and voices rose in hymns, I sat in silence, bracing myself for what was to come. The funeral was only the beginning. The real reckoning would begin when the will was read. The glass tower in downtown Houston loomed over me as I pulled the Mustang into the garage, its rough growl out of place among silent electric sedans lined in polished rows. By the time I reached the 20th floor, my shirt clung to my back, not from the heat, but from the weight of what was coming. Marcus Langford's office stretched wide, paneled with dark walnut, its walls lined with oil paintings of rigs against orange Texas skies. The boardroom table gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, polished to the point that every nervous movement reflected back like a mirror. Preston and Vivian sat at the head of the table, their posture rigid, their eyes bright with the confidence of heirs about to collect. My father adjusted his cufflinks, as though the cameras of a press conference were already trained on him. My mother rested her manicured hands on the table, lips curved in a faint smile. I took a seat at the far end, my hands still stained with grease despite my best efforts. The smell of motor oil clung to me, and I caught Preston wrinkle his nose, as though I had brought something filthy into a sacred space. Marcus entered quietly, carrying a leather folder. He cleared his throat, and in the silence, even the tick of the wall clock felt sharp. "This is the last will and testament of Elias Hawthorne, updated March of last year," he began. The words rolled like stones across the table, heavy and final. The first allocation came quickly. Preston and Vivian would inherit the River Oaks estate and a sum of $500,000, on the condition that they remain actively employed with Hawthorne Energy Solutions for no less than 2 years, or until such time as the company was sold. Preston's jaw tightened, he leaned forward, as though he hadn't heard correctly. Vivian blinked rapidly, her polished composure cracking. Then Marcus read on, "To my grandson, Riker Voss, I leave $33.5 million and 65% of the company's shares, naming him chairman of the board." The words hung in the air, stretching the silence until it felt like the walls themselves might shatter. Preston's hand slammed against the table, the sound echoing against the glass walls. His Mont Blanc pen clattered to the marble floor, rolling to a stop by my foot. Vivian's voice trembled. "No, no, he promised us. He told us." But the words dissolved before they found shape. Marcus raised his hand, and his voice steadied the room. "Elias left one final statement. I leave my estate to Riker Voss, the only one in this family who truly understood what mattered to me." I hadn't planned on smiling, but it broke through unbidden. I remembered the late night in the garage, the question Elias asked me when oil dripped from the Mustang's crankshaft, "Between money and what's right, which would you choose?" My answer had carried into this room, into this moment. But Marcus wasn't finished. From his folder, he drew a smaller envelope, sealed with wax. "There is also a personal letter," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "He instructed that it be given to you only after the will was read in full." The room contracted. Preston's glare fixed on me, his voice sharp and venomous. "He wrote to you. Only you." The air thickened, pressing down on my chest. I closed my hand around the envelope, its edges stiff against my palm. Preston leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The pen lay forgotten on the floor between us, the weight of it, of everything, lingering like a challenge. The Mustang's engine echoed in the concrete garage beneath the tower, its vibration rattling the walls as I sat there with the envelope burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't drive home. My hands gripped the wheel, but my mind replayed Preston's voice, the fury in his eyes, the way Vivian's world had cracked in an instant. Finally, I cut the ignition and sat in the dim yellow light of the parking garage, the silence heavy. With a deep breath, I tore the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Elias's handwriting was steady, deliberate, every stroke carrying the weight of confession. I chose work over family, the letter began. I left Leora to carry what I should have carried with her, and I have lived with regret ever since. The truth is, she was the one who founded Hawthorne Energy Solutions. I only built upon what she created. I cannot undo the way history erased her, but I can choose who carries this forward. And I choose you, not because of blood or inheritance, but because in you I see the patience, the honesty, and the stubborn loyalty that once lived in both of us. My hands trembled. The pages blurred as my eyes burned. For years, the family had told a single story, that Elias built everything, that Preston was destined to inherit. But this letter cracked the story wide open. Leora had been the spark, Elias had lived with regret, and now, the responsibility had been placed on me. I understood then why my parents clung so desperately to the company. They believed it was rightfully theirs, but they never truly understood its origin. To them, it was proof of prestige, a golden ticket. To Elias, and now to me, it was a burden and a chance to honor what had been lost. A sharp sound broke the silence, footsteps echoed through the garage. Preston emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with rage. Before I could react, he ripped the letter from my hands. His eyes scanned the lines, and his voice rose, raw and furious. So it's true. My mother started this. Not him. Not me. You think this makes you worthy? You're nothing. Nothing. His shout reverberated through the concrete. He shoved the letter into his jacket pocket. I'll show them all. I'll show Houston you stole this from us. Before I could move, my phone buzzed. Vivian's voice cut through, cold and deliberate. We've spoken to our attorneys. We'll contest the will, and the press will hear that you manipulated a dying man. You won't just lose this, you'll be ruined. The call ended. Preston's eyes drilled into mine, daring me to fight back. His fists clenched. For a moment, the garage was silent, except for our ragged breathing and the flickering hum of the fluorescent lights. I stepped back, the weight of the decision pressing down harder than ever. If I stayed quiet, they would bury the truth and drag me down with them. If I spoke, the family name would be torn open before the city, every secret spilled. Elias's words echoed in my mind, don't use this fortune as a weapon. Use it to set things right. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the Mustang roared to life. The red glow of the taillights filled the garage as I glanced in the mirror. Preston stood there, clutching the letter, his shadow long and sharp on the wall. My hands tightened around the wheel. They want a war, I whispered to myself. Then I'll fight them with the truth. The car shot forward into the night, carrying me toward the storm that was waiting. By the time I stepped into Marcus Langford's boardroom, the noise of reporters outside the glass tower was already swelling. News had leaked, carried out of Preston and Vivian's mouths like ammunition. The air in the room was so tight I could feel it press against my chest. Afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, spilling across the polished walnut table and bouncing off its slick surface like a spotlight aimed at every move we made. Preston and Vivian arrived with their own attorney, each step sharp with purpose. In Preston's hand was a photocopy of Elias's letter, the one he had ripped from me in the garage. He waved it like a weapon, declaring to Marcus and anyone who would listen that I had tricked a dying man into rewriting history. He manipulated my father, Preston barked. He preyed on weakness. This fortune belongs to us, not him. Vivian's voice slid in after his, colder and more rehearsed. If we must, we'll take this to the public. Let everyone see the betrayal for themselves. I sat still, the original envelope heavy in my pocket, my pulse pounding, but my hand steady. Marcus raised his palms, his voice calm, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the strain. We'll address this civilly. Evidence speaks louder than accusations. The room felt less like a meeting and more like a trial, sunlight cutting hard lines across each of our faces. When Preston pushed the copy across the table, I stood and drew out the second envelope, the one Elias had hidden in the Mustang. No one else had known it existed. I unfolded the pages, careful to show the notarized seal at the bottom. This is a duplicate, I said, my voice louder than I expected. Elias left it with me in case the first was ever contested. Written across the margin, in his familiar handwriting, was the note, this is my final word for Riker, in case the rest is questioned. The room froze. The silence pressed harder than any noise. I opened the letter and read aloud the words Elias had left. Hawthorne Energy Solutions was born from the vision and courage of Leora Chen. Preston never understood that. Riker, I believe you are the only one willing to honor it. My throat tightened, but I forced each word out clearly. It was not just an inheritance, it was an unveiling. The air shifted, as though the very walls had leaned in to hear. Gasps broke from the corners of the room. Even Marcus's careful composure flickered for a moment. Generations of stories tilted on their axis. Preston's skin flushed, his fists trembling on the table. He lunged forward, his voice cracking under the weight of fury. If it was my mother who started it, then I deserve it more than you. I am her son. You are nothing but a bystander. He snatched at the paper, his movements frantic, and in the chaos, his Mont Blanc pen slipped from his jacket. It clattered across the glass surface, then dropped to the marble floor with a ringing echo that seemed to hang in the air. The symbol of his arrogance lay there, small and useless. I rose, my voice steady in the charged silence. I never asked for this money. I never asked for this power. But if this company came from her, then I will make sure her name is remembered, and I will carry forward the values Elias wanted to protect. That is the only inheritance that matters to me. Marcus straightened, his tone firm and final. Both the original will and this notarized copy confirm each other. There is no legal basis for dispute. Elias's wishes are clear. The rage drained from Preston and Vivian's faces, replaced with something quieter and heavier. The fight had been pulled from their hands. Outside the glass walls, cameras clicked and reporters jostled. But in that room, the sound that mattered most was the silence of two people realizing their certainty had collapsed. For me, it wasn't victory in numbers, it was watching the truth finally stand in daylight, unshaken, undeniable. When I finally left the tower, the sun had shifted low over Houston, painting the sky in streaks of copper and crimson. The Mustang's engine rumbled as I steered it out of the parking structure, leaving behind the swarm of reporters and the bitter silence of Preston and Vivian. Their last words as they stormed out still echoed, "You are no son of ours." But now, stripped of weight and audience, the words were hollow, their power had dissolved in the face of proof. The city thinned as I drove north, the skyscrapers shrinking in my rearview mirror. On the highway, the roar of the Mustang filled the spaces between my thoughts. At a red light, I reached into my jacket and unfolded Elias's letter again, reading the lines until they felt etched into me. Riker, do not use this wealth as a weapon. Use it to heal. I failed Leora, and I failed Preston. Do not make my mistake. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing his voice as though he sat beside me. It wasn't a warning, it was a plea. The fortune, the company, the power meant little if I carried it like a blade. It had to be something else, something that stitched together instead of tearing apart. When I pulled into my garage, I sat in the car, letting the engine idle. Something nudged at me, a thought unresolved. I opened the glove box again, searching through the stack of old manuals and ragged envelopes. My fingers touched a small photograph tucked deep inside, the edges were curled with time. I slid it out and stared. Elias and Leora stood together in front of the Lone Star Cantina, rain speckling the glass behind them, her red coat a bright flame against the night. Both of them were smiling, the kind of unguarded joy that only exists at the beginning of a dream. On the back, scrawled in Elias's hand, were 5 words, "Family is the only legacy." I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a slow rush. Now it was clear, he hadn't chosen me to be the wealthiest or the most powerful, he had chosen me to remember, to carry what both of them had started, not the empire, but the truth. That night, I decided what to do. A portion of the inheritance would form the Leora Chen Scholarship Fund, supporting young women in engineering and technology, giving others the chance she once fought for when doors were closed to her. The rest would stay in the company, not as a monument to money, but as a promise to integrity. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I turned the Mustang toward the freeway. The tires hummed across the pavement, steady and sure. In the rearview mirror, the fading light caught dust drifting in the cabin, and for just a moment, I thought I saw Elias in the passenger seat, nodding with quiet pride. The Mustang roared into the night, carrying me forward, not weighed down by $34 million, but lifted by the knowledge that what I held wasn't just money, it was a story, a name, a fire passed down through time, and it was mine to keep alive. The conference room wasn't grand, it was tucked inside a mid-sized civic building downtown, fluorescent lights humming overhead, folding chairs lined in rows. But the weight in the air was heavier than in Marcus Langford's glass tower. The press had gathered, cameras trained on the podium where I stood. Behind me, a banner read simply, "The Leora Chen Scholarship Fund." I cleared my throat and looked out across the crowd. Reporters leaned forward with their recorders, and I could feel their skepticism ripple through the room. They hadn't come for good news, they had come for blood, for drama, for a sound bite to fill the evening broadcast. Elias's last letter lay on the lectern, folded neatly, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of why I was here. My grandfather left me more than money, I began, my voice steady, though my palms sweated. He left me the truth. For too long, history told only half the story of Hawthorne Energy Solutions. Today, I acknowledge the other half, the half that belonged to Leora Chen. Without her, none of this would exist. And in her name, we will give opportunities to young women who deserve the chances she never had. A hand shot up. Riker, what about the accusations from your parents? A reporter asked, his tone sharp. They've claimed you manipulated your grandfather in his final days. Cameras zoomed closer. I didn't flinch. My parents have their own wounds, I said. They grew up in the shadow of expectations and ambition. My father never stopped reaching for validation from his mother, and my mother believed appearances were everything. I won't deny their pain, but I also won't let their anger erase the truth. My grandfather saw in me the values he lost along the way, and he trusted me to carry them forward. Murmurs swept across the room. Then another voice, gentler, rose from the back. Mrs. Ramirez stood among the crowd, a scarf draped over her shoulders, her eyes shining. She wasn't part of the press, but her presence spoke louder than their microphones. I watched this boy grow up fixing cars and pipes for neighbors without asking for a dime, she said. He's no thief. He's the only one who remembers what family should mean. The words stilled the noise. I felt the burn in my chest ease, as though someone had placed a hand over my heart and reminded me I wasn't alone. And then I saw him, Preston, standing at the edge of the room, away from the cameras. He wasn't the proud man in a tailored suit anymore, his tie hung loose, his face pale and drawn. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, I didn't see the enemy who had tried to tear me down. I saw a man broken by a lifetime of living in someone else's shadow. His lips moved, as if to say something, but no sound came. Then he turned and slipped out the door. I gripped the lectern harder. Part of me wanted to chase him, to say that I understood, but another part knew he needed to walk through his own reckoning. Elias's letter had told me not to use the inheritance as a weapon. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about saying the words out loud, maybe it was about not letting hate define the legacy. By the time the conference ended, the reporters had their headlines. Some would still question me, still spin doubt. But the scholarship fund was real, the name on the banner undeniable. And for the first time, I felt like the truth wasn't just something I carried, it was something I had finally set free. The garage smelled the same as it had when Elias was alive, motor oil, dust, and the faint trace of cedar from the old workbench. The Mustang sat in the center, hood open, like it was waiting for me to finish what we had started together. For weeks, I had been working late nights, tightening bolts, replacing gaskets, patching the faded leather seats. Tonight, the last piece was ready. I slid the final strip of upholstery into place, smoothed it down, and lowered the hood. My reflection stared back at me in the polished steel. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, not in the uneven coughs it once had, but in a smooth, confident hum. For the first time since Elias's death, the Mustang sounded whole. As I leaned back in the driver's seat, something shifted in the glove box. I opened it and found a folded scrap of paper I hadn't seen before, tucked behind a manual. In Elias's handwriting, the words were brief, "You won't be alone on this road." My throat tightened, and I sat in the quiet, the letter resting against my palm like a final blessing. I drove through East Houston, the Mustang gliding past the cracked sidewalks and faded murals. Children played on stoops, neighbors waved, and the street smelled of tortillas and barbecue smoke. I slowed when I saw Mrs. Ramirez struggling with her porch light, and without thinking, I pulled over. In minutes, I had the wiring fixed, the bulb glowing warm against the evening sky. She clasped my hands, whispering, "Thank you." It felt like nothing had changed. I was still the boy who fixed things for the people who needed it most. But everything had changed. Back on the freeway, the sun had dropped low, painting the sky in gold. The city sprawled beneath me, glittering with both wealth and want, ambition and exhaustion. I thought of Leora in her red coat, standing outside the cantina with fire in her eyes. I thought of Elias leaning over an engine, teaching me patience while hiding his regrets. I thought of Preston, lost between them, never knowing which path to follow. In the rearview mirror, the fading light caught dust drifting in the cabin. For a moment, it shimmered like a presence, like Elias riding shotgun, nodding with that quiet pride I had seen so many times. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I pressed the accelerator. The Mustang surged forward over the I-45 bridge, its engine singing into the night. Behind me lay the shadows of anger, betrayal, and silence. Ahead stretched miles of open road, carrying not just me, but the legacy of two people who had built a dream and left it in my care. Family wasn't the money, it wasn't the mansion or the titles. Family was the truth, the memory, the responsibility to keep the fire alive. As the lights of Houston blurred around me, I knew I wasn't driving away from the past, I was carrying it forward, keeping it alive in every mile yet to come. The car roared, steady and strong, and I felt, for the first time, completely free.